Chapter 99. The trial was almost over, and now came the really hard part, waiting for the verdict. That Tuesday, the jurors retired to the jury room to commence their deliberations in the murder trial of Jeffrey Schaefer. I allowed myself to actually think the unthinkable, that Schaefer might be set free. Sampson and I sat in the rear row of the courtroom and watched the 12 members depart, 8 men and 4 women. John had come to court several times, calling it the best and sleaziest show this side of the Oval Office. But I knew he was there to give me support. The son of a bitch is guilty. He's mad as little Davy Berkowitz, Sampson said as he watched Schaefer. But he has a lot of good actors on his side. Doting wife, doting mistress, well-paid lawyer, silly Billy. He could get away with it. It happens, I agreed. Juries are hard to read and getting harder. I watched as Schaefer courteously shook hands with the members of his defense team. Jules and Jane Halpern both had forced smiles on their faces. They know, don't they? Their client is the Weasel, a mass murderer. Jeffrey Schaefer has the ability to make people believe in him when he needs to. He's the best actor I've seen, I said. Then John left and I snuck out the back way again. This time neither Schaefer nor the press was lying in wait downstairs or in the rear parking lot. In the lot I heard a woman's voice, and I stopped moving. I thought it was Christine. A dozen or so people were walking to their cars, seemingly unaware of me. I felt fevered and hot as I checked them all. None of them was her. Where had the voice come from? I took a ride in the old Porsche and listened to George Benson on the CD player. I remembered the police report about Schaefer's thrill-seeking ride that ended near DuPont Circle. It seemed a strangely appealing prospect. I took my own advice not to try to guess how the jury would decide the case. It could go either way. I let myself think about Christine, and I choked up. It was too much. Tears began to stream down my cheeks. I had to pull over. I took a deep breath, then another. The pain in my chest was still as fresh as it had been the day she disappeared in Bermuda. She tried to stay away from me, but I wouldn't let her. I was responsible for what had happened to her. I drove around Washington, riding in gently aimless circles. I finally reached home more than 2.5 hours after leaving the courthouse. Nana came running out of the house. She must have seen me pull into the driveway. She'd obviously been waiting for me. I leaned out of the driver's side window. The DJ was still talking congenially on public radio. "What is it, old woman? What's the matter now?" I asked Nana. "Ms. Fitzgibbon called you, Alex. The jury is coming back. They have a verdict." Chapter 100. I was apprehensive as could be, but I was also curious beyond anything I could remember. I backed out of the driveway and sped downtown. I got back to the courthouse in less than 15 minutes. The crowd on East Street was even larger and more unruly than it had been at the height of the trial. At least a half-dozen Union Jacks waved in the wind. Contrasting with them were American flags, including some painted across bare chests and faces. I had to push and literally inch my way through the crush of people up close to the courthouse steps. I ignored every question from the press. I tried to avoid anyone with a camera in hand or the hungry look of a reporter. I entered the packed courtroom just before the jury filed back inside. You almost missed it, I said to myself. Judge Fesco spoke to the crowd as soon as everyone was seated. There will be no demonstrations when this verdict is read. If any demonstrations occur, marshals will clear this room immediately, he instructed in a soft but clear voice. I stood a few rows behind the prosecution team and tried to find a regular breathing pattern. It was inconceivable that Jeffrey Schaefer could be set free. There was no doubt in my mind that he'd murdered several people, not just Patsy Hampton, but at least some of the Jane Does as well. He was a wanton pattern killer, one of the worst, and had been getting away with it for years. I realized now that Schaefer might be the most courageous and daring of all the killers I'd faced. He played his game with the pedal pressed to the floor. He absolutely refused to lose. Mr. Foreman, do you have a verdict for us? Judge Fesco asked in somber tones. Raymond Horton, the foreman, replied, Your Honor, we have a verdict. I glanced over at Schaefer. He appeared confident, as he had since the trial began. He was dressed today in a tailored suit, white shirt, and tie. He had no conscience whatsoever. He had no fear of anything that might happen to him. Maybe that was a partial explanation for why he'd run free for so long. Judge Fesco looked unusually stern. Very well. Will the defendant please rise? Jeffrey Schaefer stood at the defense table, and his longish blonde hair gleamed under the bright overhead lighting. He towered over Jules Halpern and his daughter Jane. Schaefer held his hands behind him as if he were cuffed. I wondered if he might have a pair of 20-sided dice clasped in them, the kind I had seen in his study. Judge Fesco addressed the foreman again. As to count one of the indictment, aggravated premeditated murder in the first degree, how do you find? The foreman, not guilty, Your Honor. I felt as if my head had suddenly spun off. The audience packed into the small room went completely wild. The press rushed to the bar. The judge had promised to clear the room, but he was already retreating to his chambers. I saw Schaefer walk toward the press, but then he quickly passed him by. What was he doing now? He noticed a man in the crowd and nodded stiffly in his direction. Who was that? Then Schaefer continued toward where I was in the fourth row. I wanted to vault over the chairs after him. I wanted him so bad, and I knew I had just lost my chance to do it the right way. Detective Cross, he said in his usual supercilious manner. Detective Cross, there's something I want to say. I've been holding it in for months. The press closed in. The scene was becoming smothering and claustrophobic. Cameras flashed on all sides. Now that the trial had ended, there was nothing to prevent picture-taking inside the courtroom. Schaefer was aware of the rare photo opportunity. Of course he was. He spoke again, so that everyone gathered around us could hear. It was suddenly quiet where we stood, a pocket of silence and foreboding expectation. You killed her, he said. and stared deeply into my eyes, almost to the back of my skull. You killed her. I went numb. My legs were suddenly weak. I knew he didn't mean Patsy Hampton. He meant Christine. She was dead. Jeffrey Schaefer had killed her. He had taken everything from me, just as he'd warned me he would. He had won.